What's up, Yinzers, Yinzettes? Welcome back to the latest edition of Pucks and Net, where I'll give you the latest downtown breakdowns and everything from the past week, in this case, couple weeks of Penguins hockey. I thank you for joining me. I'm your host, Kelsey Surmats of the Hockey News. You can find me on X at Kelsey_Surmats4. You can also read my work on the Hockey News THN website for the Penguins. So, yeah, first of all, it has been a few weeks. There's, been a few things going on, both personally and just professionally. It's just been a very busy time for me. So I apologize from the outset, but I might have some good news on the horizon in terms of a permanent co-host. More details to come later, but hopefully we should be getting back to a weekly thing here more regularly, especially, with the draft coming up, with free agency coming up. I don't want you guys to miss a beat. I don't want us to miss a beat. So we're going to be back in full swing. But yeah, a lot's happened since we last met, since I was last on. Obviously, the news of Dan Muse being hired as the 23rd coach in Pittsburgh Penguins history was kind of the big talking point. There's been a couple other things that have happened too. We'll go over all of that in this episode. But I do want to start with that Dan Muse press conference. He did meet with us media members on Wednesday, which was June 11th. And I think there was a lot to pull from this presser. And first of all, just a little bit of background on Muse. So he does have a really long history in development. And I think that was kind of the sticking point with Kyle Dubas and the Penguins organization when they were looking at their hire. Because if you really look at most of the guys they were talking to, most of the women they were talking to within this process, that was the sticking point. There was a history of development. There was a history of success in developmental leagues, and a lot of them were also assistant coaches at the NHL level. We heard that they talked to Mitch Love, assistant coach of the Washington Capitals. We heard about DJ Smith from the Los Angeles Kings. Also had some time with Dubas in the Toronto Maple Leafs organization. Was the head coach of the Ottawa Senators for 5 years from 2018 to 2023, but ultimately, they landed on Rangers assistant coach Dan Muse. And I think, when you look back, he did have some collegiate coaching career. He started out in consecutive years in Milton Academy, Williams College, and Sacred Heart as an assistant. And then his first major coaching position was with Yale University as an assistant coach. He did mention Keith Elaine in his presser, who was the head coach at Yale at the time when he was there. They did lead the team to a national championship in 2013. But he mentioned, Elaine is one of the primary influences in his coaching journey, as well as Peter Laviolette, which he did have an assistant coaching gig with the Nashville Predators as well. But sandwiched between that gig with the Predators and, with the New York Rangers, he did have a lot of, experience in USA hockey. And I think this is what really kind of stands out. He was with the USHL Chicago Steel, led them to a Clark Cup in 2017. And that was just before the Nashville gig. But between that Nashville gig and the New York Rangers gig, he was with the U.S. National Team Development Program. And he led the 2021 and 2023 IIHF World Under-18 Championship squads. And they won the title in 2023 under Muse. He did coach Penguins forward prospect Rutger McGroarty on the 2021 World Squad, as well as with the development program. So, this diverse resume, this experience in different developmental leagues. Again, collegiate, he was in juniors with the USHL program, and he was with the National Team Development Program. So this is a draw for a Penguins organization that's in the stage that it's in. I think something that was reiterated during this presser was how the Penguins are in a transitional period. Muse said this himself. Dubas said this. And that doesn't mean, I know a lot of people are looking out at the doom and gloom of the next 5 to 7 years of Penguins hockey being a perpetual rebuild. I still think this is something they want to get done as urgently as possible. But I mean, it's not something they're going to rush either. And they mentioned timelines a couple times during this press conference, and Muse kind of repeated what Dubas said in his season-ending presser, that this isn't something that they want to put a definite time stamp on. But they're going to start this work right away. Development is the focus. And this was mentioned several times throughout this press conference. And first of all, I do want to just share what Muse said, just in case you missed, about getting the coaching positions with the Penguins. And he said, it's an honor to work in the NHL. It's a huge honor to be a head coach in this league. It's extremely humbling to be a part of this organization, this city, working with this staff and these players. I couldn't be more excited to get started here. So that was kind of what he said. Dubas made it pretty clear that as they went further into the process with the interviews, that Muse was going to be their guy. And he also mentioned that, this is somebody that he hadn't previously had any connections to. He didn't previously have any connections to Dan Muse in this process. And like I said, he did have connections to a few other guys. But Dubas kind of said that that's something that stood out to him. He was kind of a relative unknown to him before this process. And, he said from the first time they spoke on the phone, when they met over Zoom, met in person, he thought that he was going to be well suited for this position. So congrats to Dan Muse, first of all, on being hired. But I do want to dig into some of the takeaways from this presser too. I mentioned development in this transitional period. And that was a really big sticking point. That was a really big focus of this presser. And, he's kind of ready to undertake that with that experience he had in the development program, with his familiarity with guys like McGroarty, and just in coaching guys like that. And something that I really liked about what he said in terms of his approach is that it's a very individualistic approach. He understands that no two guys are the same that are coming up through the system. And he wants to work with every single player to kind of meet expectations and also get the most out of them. He was talking about veterans and, young players alike. And I think somebody that can work with, each, wherever players are at in their respective careers and being able to get the most out of them is something that is important for a head coach in this time for the Penguins. It's going to be a few years before they're contenders again, at least. There's a lot of talk about the 2026 offseason kind of being consequential. We'll keep an eye on that. It doesn't seem like, at least for now, that the Penguins are really going to push to compete this season. So there's going to be a lot of important work that's still happening this season. It's not just going to be about tanking. It's not just going to be about the Penguins hopefully having a shot at the draft lottery next season, guys. There's going to be some development that takes place with these younger players. We're going to see younger players on this NHL roster next season, and Muse is going to be a big part of that process. And I really liked what he said here, because I mentioned he has an individualistic approach to all of this. He said everybody's different. Everybody's path's going to be different. So as a coach, you enjoy that part of it because you've got to learn who the person is to really work with them and help them. And then he also added, you have guys in different places in their careers, and that's very clear. My job coming in here is going to be to help maximize each person and to help each person work towards what their highest level could be right now. And that's going to be my focus. And he mentioned a couple other things, too, that they're going to be working on this from day one of training camp, and putting a lot of thought into this plan throughout the summer, both holistically for the team and for individual players. And then the other takeaway that, couple other takeaways, there's a lot of talk about collaboration between Dubas and Muse. This was a big sticking point. Muse even said this. He said that this was something that drew him to the job, was the opportunity to collaborate with the general manager. and just with the staff in general. So I expect to see that a lot. I expect there to be a lot of back and forth between Dubas, Muse, and they both said that themselves. And just in terms of building out the team, in terms of what the expectations are. Dubas mentioned the give and take between the two of them. So it's good to see that collaboration happening. But I think the one thing that probably stood out most to me about this presser and what Muse was saying is when he was talking about his systems approach. Now, he was asked this question in a few different ways by a couple different people. And, you know, basically in a nutshell, the way the questions were framed is, you know, the Penguins have been a heavy forechecking team for years. And that's been their focus, like all gas offense. You know, but basically they asked, is this something you're going to dial back? Is this going to be a more defensive, focused system? And yes, if you've followed, Muse's coaching career, and for what I understand, I can't claim to be an expert on Muse's systems. That's probably more something for Jesse Marshall, The Athletic. He put out a great article about this about a week ago. But, Muse's system seems a little bit more catered to defense, but I liked what he said because he said basically, no, it's not going to be, a system catered to defense. You got to play offense and defense. And he kept mentioning just adaptability and being able to beat opponents in different ways and play different systems and different styles. And the reason this stands out to me is because I know if you've been watching any playoff frenzy lives for the hockey news after the playoff games, I haven't been on in the last couple weeks, but this is something I've talked about with the Florida Panthers on these shows. Is just something that really stands out about the Florida Panthers is their ability to be adaptable and play the game that the game demands. They can play a shutdown brand of hockey if they need to. They can play a run and gun style if they need to. They can frustrate you. They can get under your skin. They can be hard to play against physically. They can suffocate you with their forecheck. They beat you in so many different ways because that team is adaptable and that team doesn't just have one concrete system that it sticks to. And I think that's something we might start to see a little bit more throughout the NHL, just this idea that it's not one, you don't have to be a stickler to one strict system. And that's something that really stood out to me about what he said, because that adaptability and that, approach to the Penguins situation, I think is going to bode well for them, especially when you think about the veterans that are still on this roster. They've been playing essentially the same system since probably the late 2010s. Mike Johnson, there was a little bit of a lull there in between because they switched to a more defensive system. And guess what? That didn't work for Sidney Crosby. Now, it's worth noting that the veterans are only going to be around for so long. And he did say that good defense creates good offense. And I do believe that too. But I like that answer. I like that answer and the focus on adaptability. And I think that hopefully that's something we'll see from Muse as he navigates this process with the players he has. And, that's another thing that was mentioned too. They're going to kind of cater their system to the personnel they have too. Because I think you kind of have to do that. You have to do that. If you don't have a Sidney Crosby on your team in 5 years, you got to figure out different ways to win. So, that heavy forechecking, all gas, no breaks, doesn't work for every team. It doesn't work for every situation. And I like this notion that they're going to be conscientious of that. And, be open to the possibility of just being adaptable. So anyway, those were kind of a few takeaways from Dan Muse's presser. Again, congratulations to Dan Muse. Next time we'll really get to talk to him is training camp. So I'm really looking forward to that opportunity to get to know Muse. And, see what he does with this team in this transitionary period. So I just wanted to move on to a couple other news bits before we get into some trade talk and some draft talk, because there is some interesting stuff happening on both fronts. But in terms of news, so there were 2 signings on Friday, and that included Boko Imama, who was re-signed to a 1-year, 2-way deal by the Penguins on Friday. Imama played 16 games for the Penguins last season, registered a goal, 30 penalty minutes. The key is that 30 penalty minutes. We all know Imama as an enforcer, as a tough guy. And he was a big presence in that locker room. Bringing him back on a 1-year deal, this is somebody that I expected to return. So this doesn't come as a shock. Dubas, the organization, the locker room, players, teammates, they all love Boko Imama. So congrats to Imama on that 1-year deal. Unfortunately, an injury, surgery ended his season early. But it will be good to see him back in a Penguins uniform next season. And I don't think he's a bad guy to have as a 13th or 14th forward. And given again the stage that the Penguins are in, we don't know what this roster is going to look like come opening night. There could be a lot that changes between now and then. So having him as an extra guy on your roster in a season where you're probably not going to be competing for much anyway, probably isn't the worst idea. Somebody's got to protect your stars. Somebody's got to play that role in the locker room. That he does. Nobody is quite like him with his energy and just his personality. So I think he'll be a good guy to have around for these younger players, especially as they develop this season. So Boko Imama back on a 1-year deal. And the other one was a 3-year entry-level contract for Penguins prospect Melvin Fernstrom. Fernstrom is 19. He was brought over in the Marcus Pettersson trade from Vancouver. And he did win SHL, Swedish Hockey League Rookie of the Year last season. He had 8 goals, 17 points in 48 games. Which on the surface, when you're looking at that production, it doesn't seem like a lot. It doesn't stand out to you. But something to keep in mind about guys coming from the Swedish Hockey League, guys coming from the KHL. When teenagers are putting up numbers and producing in, top 6 minutes with grown adults playing in these leagues, that's a positive sign. And the Penguins really like Fernstrom. Dubas did mention, after the Penguins acquired Fernstrom, that he was somebody they were looking to draft initially anyway. So there is some intrigue with Fernstrom. The biggest knock on him is his skating. And if you've ever seen him skate, it is a little bit, I don't want to say awkward. I don't really know the right word for it. But there are some improvements to be made there. And I do think in order to skate at the NHL level and be up to NHL speed, Fernstrom is going to have to work on a lot of things with his skating, with his first steps, with his acceleration. But overall, there is skill there. You see some raw talent, and I think that's the key word with him right now, is that he's very raw. But I think this could be kind of a sneaky good pickup for the Penguins if he can improve that skating and if he can work on that. We saw too, especially he signed this 3-year entry-level deal. We don't know where he's going to play hockey next season. It's possible that he could still be on loan to the SHL, so we'll see what happens. But, we saw from this past season, Rutger McGroarty had some skating issues, out of training camp at the onset of the season. He did make the NHL roster for those first 3 games of the NHL season. And you saw those deficiencies in his skating, right? But then, at the end of the season, McGroarty mentioned that he was working all season on his skating. Like, that was the biggest focus for him. And you saw that improvement. Like, you saw a tangible improvement in his first step at the end of the season. And all of a sudden, it was kind of a non-issue. when he was up for his second stint, and we saw that in the way that he played. So I think my hope is that hopefully the Penguins strength, conditioning, skating staff can work with Fernstrom and make this not necessarily a strength, but just something that's not a weakness anymore for him. And we'll see how that plays out, but hopefully being within the organization. Again, we'll see where he plays next season, but he still will be, in pretty close contact with the Penguins and their conditioning staff. So hopefully we'll see some improvements in Fernstrom skating over the next season. And that'll be something that we'll be able to tangibly say has been improved. But pretty intriguing prospect. We'll see what happens with him next season. Then the other big news of the week was actually regarding ownership. And so it was reported by Pierre LeBrun, NHL Insider, The Athletic, TSN. Apparently, Mario Lemieux and Ron Burkle are interested in repurchasing the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, in the report, LeBrun also later reported that FSG was looking to get out from the Penguins. He said that they were looking to, for an exit. Look, I'm not an NHL insider. I can't claim to have any information, or at least any information that others don't have on this topic at this point. I'm not sure how much I buy into the idea that FSG is looking to just get out from under the Penguins. This is an ownership group. I know some of the narratives have been out there, but this ownership group is invested in advancing the team. And invested, in the Penguins becoming a winning organization again. And, it was reported in January that FSG was interested in selling minority shares and looking for minority investors in the Penguins. And, I feel like that's probably still more the case here, even if Lemieux, Burkle, and David Morehouse are in the picture for this. But we'll see. I mean, I think there is some smoke to this. We'll see how much of, the Penguins that the FSG wants to sell off. But if this rumor is true about Burkle, Lemieux, David Morehouse wanting to purchase the Penguins, there is a rumored second party involved. I am not privy to that. But we can speculate all day long. Jags, if you're out there. He was in Pittsburgh this week, not for that. He was just accepting an Emmy. But you never know. They said there's a surprise second party. And seems kind of fitting, but you could speculate all day long about who that second party is, how much involvement Ron Burkle, Mario Lemieux, David Morehouse want in this organization again. Whether this is a minority share, whether they're trying to buy back the team majority, we don't really know at this point. But either way, this is kind of interesting, especially considering, how things ended. And I don't want to say ended with Lemieux. He is still a minority shareholder in the Pittsburgh Penguins. But as many Penguins fans, media members, pretty much anyone following the team is aware, Lemieux hasn't exactly been around for the last couple seasons. There was a falling out with FSG, that took place after the sale occurred. And, it's interesting that they're reportedly coming back in and swooping back in to purchase a larger share of the team, whatever that may be. So we'll follow this story. I'm going to be following it on the Hockey News. So if you haven't already, please join our roundtable community. It's the best way to get, news updates, follow along with the latest Pittsburgh Penguins news updates. There's a little community on there where you can post to the community board. really kind of become a part of the conversation. So if you haven't joined our roundtable community, download the app, do that. But this is something we will be following over these next few weeks, because this is an interesting story to say the least. And like I said, having Lemieux and Burkle back in the picture after the hard falling out that allegedly happened with FSG, that's pretty interesting. So, like I said, there is some smoke to that. How much they want to sell, I'm not privy to those conversations or privy to any inside information on that, but keep your eyes out, folks. We'll see where this goes. Because if that is true, and if they do purchase back the Penguins, it'll be interesting to see what direction they take. And honestly, what their motivation is. I mean, you could argue they sold high on the team and now it's at a buy low point. They're just trying to buy back the team at a, buy a low point. But I think there's more to it than that. I mean, there has to be, right? I mean, Lemieux wanting to get back involved with the Penguins in that capacity, there has to be a pretty good reason. So it'd be interesting to see what effect that has on the front office, what effect that has on their window of contention, what effect that has on Sidney Crosby and the rest of the core. There are a lot of implications for something like that happening. So we'll see. Keep your eyes peeled, folks. I'm personally, again, without any information really to go off of other than what's been reported and what I know in comparison to what everybody else knows at this point, I still think this is probably more of a minority shareholder conversation, but maybe Lemieux and Burkle are just trying to push for more. And like I said, there has to be a good reason for that. If it does happen, and if they do become the majority owners again, we'll see what kind of changes that kind of sets in motion for the organization. If that changes their timeline, if it changes their front office at all, if Dubas is safe, which personally at this point, I think you got to see through the process at least a little bit, for the next couple years, but we'll see. Keep your eyes peeled, folks. Keep your eyes peeled. But yeah, some of the news coming out of this week, and this is where we're going to get into the trade talk a little bit. And first, I do want to talk about some of the news that came out yesterday. So again, Pierre LeBrun is on a roll, and he said on TSN 1050 that the Penguins are getting a lot of calls about Bryan Rust. Now, I don't think this is a shock to anyone. Rust's no movement clause expires this summer. He had a career year last season, career highs pretty much in everything, 31 goals, 65 points. He missed 11 games last season, still put up those numbers. He's 33, but he's a hot commodity for a reason. I mean, Rust has scored 20 plus goals for 6 consecutive NHL seasons. And he's the kind of player, he's the kind of leader, the kind of veteran presence that any contending team would want on their roster. So it doesn't come as any surprise that he's the most sought after trade target from the Penguins for these contending teams. And another report that was put out by LeBrun, earlier in the week was that the Penguins were the only true sellers on the NHL market this offseason, which to me that's a little bit of a surprise. Considering what's at stake next season with Gavin McKenna, who's pretty, widely labeled as a generational talent. I mean, this isn't like previous first overall picks like the Celebrinis, even the Bedards. Like, this is a Connor McDavid type player, Sidney Crosby type player. So I'm not saying you'd think that more teams would be more openly tanking, but it is a bit surprising to hear that, some of these even bottom feeder teams are kind of trying to improve next season. You think of the Blackhawks. The Sharks are understandable. The Sharks are almost there. You think of the Anaheim Ducks. You think of Philadelphia Flyers, the Boston Bruins. These are teams that are either stuck in this weird limbo zone, and I qualify Anaheim there, I qualify Buffalo there. Or, I think Boston is the most similar to Pittsburgh, where they were pretty heavy sellers at the deadline. And they don't really have that much in terms of prospect talent, in terms of roster talent. So you'd think that a team like Boston, even though they still have David Pastrnak playing at a really high level, you'd think that a team like Boston would say, yeah, hey, we're going to be sellers. I think maybe part of the difference there is that Boston just doesn't have anybody to sell other than Pastrnak. At least not with the value that some of the guys on the Penguins do have. But, as far as Rust, this is an interesting one for me. And I wrote a piece on this yesterday. You can check it out on the Hockey News website. I will probably share it again because I think this is something that a lot of people have a lot of feelings about, and understandably so. I mean, Bryan Rust has been with the Penguins for a decade now. And he's one of those players, he's such a unique case because unlike some of the top star players on the Penguins, this is a guy who went through all the stages of development and kind of had to work his way into the role he's now found himself in. He played college for Notre Dame. He came into the Penguins organization, spent some time in the AHL, developed there. Now former head coach Mike Sullivan, even said that when he coached Rust at the AHL level, he didn't expect him to be a top 6 player. He was a fourth line, third line grinder, penalty killer, somebody that worked really hard, but that seemed to be his role. And for the first couple seasons of his NHL career, that was his role. Bryan Rust was a bottom 6 player, for those cup runs. And then you saw him blossom into a top 6 player. He earned all his flowers that way. And, you can talk about Rust's story and you're like, why is this relevant to trade talk? Well, I think it kind of is in a sense, because if you look at where the Penguins are at in this transitional period, in this period where they're going to be focusing on development, where they're going to be focused on prospects and bringing in younger players to usher in this new generation for the Penguins, they're going to need voices in that locker room, some veteran presence to kind of guide them through this process. And, this is not a knock on Sidney Crosby in the slightest, but I think the difference between a veteran like Crosby and Malkin, and even Letang and Carlson to an extent, they did see some time developing before they were NHL regulars, but that time period was pretty short. Russ is somebody who's been there, done that. And most of these young guys that the Penguins are going to be bringing in via the draft, via trades, via the prospect pool that already exists, the guys that they already have. These guys are more likely to take a Rust-like path than they are to take a Crosby-like path, right? And I think they can learn a lot from a guy like Rust. Again, who has been there, who has done that, who has had to scratch and claw his way into the role that he's in. That's valuable. That's a valuable voice to have in your locker room for these younger guys who are going to be competing for spots, who are going to be looking to make improvements, looking to just develop probably in a similar way to how Rust has developed. talking to guys this season, he's always mentioned in conversations about, being a mentor in the locker room, with the likeness of a guy like Crosby. I actually wrote a piece earlier this season about how Sidney Crosby's leadership and mentorship is kind of passed on to multiple generations of teammates, while Rust was part of that first-ish generation. And now Rust is in Crosby's shoes. He's kind of one of those guys that are taking the reins and helping these young players. And that's no small thing. You need a guy who's been there and had that experience and can really, really, help these guys along in that process of development in the locker room. That's important. Sidney Crosby, for as great as he is, that's an experience he never had. He never had to spend time in the AHL. He never had to spend time in college hockey. He jumped into the NHL and he had 102 points in his first season, and all credit to Sid, but that's just not going to be the reality for these young players that the Penguins are bringing in. So personally, I'm of the belief that you keep Rust unless there's a perfect deal in place, unless somebody is out there with a massive overpay that you just can't refuse. But if I'm the Penguins, Rust is the guy you want to keep around. He's a valuable guy to have in that locker room. He's a valuable presence for these young players in their development. If there's not a trade that makes sense, or not even just makes sense. I mean, I think there are situations where a trade might make sense and you still keep him. If there's not an overpay out there, if there's not a deal that Dubas looks at and says, like, man, I can't pass this up, I'm keeping Rust. That's just me. Because if you think about it too, I mean, they have other tradable assets. They already have the most draft capital for the next 3 drafts. They have 30 draft picks over the next 3 seasons. They have 18 draft picks within the first 3 rounds. Knowing what we know about the NHL trade deadline this past season, there's a good chance that Rickard Rakell can net a first in return. Karlsson has value, although his contract's big, and part of the value will be retention probably on the Penguins side of things. He still has enough value that you can get pretty, a good trade return for him. They have a couple other guys they can deal and get assets and get that valuable draft capital, get prospects, whoever you want in return. Rust, I'm just not so sure that they should, pull the trigger on that unless there is a can't refuse type offer. If there's not, Bryan Rust should be in Pittsburgh for the foreseeable future because that matters. That matters. And one last point on this before we move on. You can't trade everybody in a rebuild on the fly situation. And that still seems to be what the Penguins are gunning for here. They mean it when they say they want to be competitive again as urgently as possible. They're still going to attempt this rebuild on the fly. They're going to try to make this happen as quickly as possible. They're not going to put a timeline on it because they want to do it the right way. But if the Penguins get what they want and everything goes according to plan, I think they'd love to make a push next season. Or not next season, in 2026, 2027. Because, that'll be 4 seasons of missing the playoffs. It'll be a couple years into the rebuild. And if they can get, a lottery pick next season, I think that's the year we might see them go pretty big in free agency and, start to open that window again. So we'll see what happens. But to me, Russ is a guy you keep around if you can help it. So aside from Rust, a couple others. We've heard talk of Marco Rossi, small update. It seems like the Wild are pulling back a little bit, on wanting to trade their I mean, I would call him their second line center. They might not call him that, but they're kind of limited on center depth and center options. So we'll see how that process unfolds. I still think that there's other teams that are probably better suited to land someone like Rossi. The Penguins don't want to give up an arm and a leg for a player like him. It's not a discredit to Rossi, but he's not somebody you quote unquote overpay for. And that's likely what's going to have to happen in order for the Penguins to acquire him in comparison to other teams. However, somebody they might want to overpay for is Jason Robertson. Dallas Stars superstar. And, there have been varying reports about Robertson. It was reported earlier in the week that Robertson was, they were listening on Robertson, basically. And that his name was floating around in trade rumors. Dallas is really, really cap strapped. They only have $4.75 million to work with this summer. They have a lot of UFAs, a lot of RFAs. They literally need cap room to be able to field a full roster next season. I mean, $4.75 million isn't enough cap space for them to sign an NHL roster. Like, they need this cap space. I think they're more probably going to try to move other pieces before moving Robertson. Those are kind of the latest reports. Mason Marchment has been brought up in a lot of talks. They have to. Someone's got to go. Whether it's him, Matt Dumba, I think those are the guys they prefer to move, obviously, before moving Jason Robertson. Because if you can have Mikko Rantanen and Jason Robertson on your team, pretty good 1-2 punch to have. But, if they don't have any takers for Marchment, if they don't have any takers for Dumba, or, if plans shift and maybe they're in the Mitch Marner sweepstakes, they decide they want to be part of that, offload as much salary as you can and throw big bucks at Mitch Marner. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think there are some variables here where it's possible and conceivable that Jason Robertson could be playing in a different uniform starting next season. And if that's the case, this is somebody you pay up for. Robertson's 25. So, I mean, he's still a young player. This isn't a player that's aging out. And, he's a pending RFA for 2026, so he will be due for a new contract. He will be due for a raise on his $7.7 million that he's currently making. But, I mean, this guy is one of the best goal scorers in the league. He had 35 goals, 80 points last season. In 2022, 2023, just 3 seasons ago, he had 109 points, 46 goals. And, from 2021 to 2023, there were 2 consecutive 40-goal seasons. This is a guy that you want to bring in if you're the Penguins. And if that takes a little bit of an overpay, guess what? You have the assets. I mean, I'm not saying that the Penguins would be able to outbid some of the other teams on the market. I mean, that is the inherent issue. There are other teams out there who would be willing to give up more NHL talent, I think, in return. But I think it's worth noting, I mean, Robertson is a pending RFA next year. And while Dallas still retains, obviously retains his rights, which it's not the same as UFA situation where their value is going to, I don't want to say tank, but their value is going to go down a little bit because of that UFA status. That's not as much the case with RFAs, but, if they're looking for a true salary dump, because that seems to be the motivating factor behind this. It's not like they just willingly want to get Jason Robertson off their roster. But, they could use a goal scorer like Rickard Rakell. He matched Robertson's goal total last year. If he's playing top line minutes with Mikko Rantanen, Rickard Rakell is going to score goals. That's something he's done throughout his career. And, obviously Rakell's 32 years old, so swapping a 35-year-old for a 32-year-old isn't exactly an ideal situation, but Dallas is in win now mode. They showed that with Mikko Rantanen. Rickard Rakell has 3 years left on his deal. He's being paid $5 million a year with a little bit of a retention from the Penguins. I mean, that could be a really attractive option for the Stars to replace some of Robertson's production for a lot cheaper. Obviously, it would take more than Rakell. I mean, it's delusional to think that a Rakell Robertson swap straight up is going to happen. But Penguins do have that conditional Rangers first round pick. We will find out by Wednesday of this coming week whether that's going to be this year's pick or next season's pick. But they have that pick to kind of dangle out there if they want to. You know, they have a couple prospects to dangle out there if they want to. They might be able to dangle one other NHL player. You know, I think at minimum, the cost to acquire Robertson is Rakell, a first, and a prospect. And this has to be a pretty decent prospect. I mean, maybe not necessarily Rucker McGroarty-ish, but more likely probably somebody like Rucker McGroarty. And while that would be unfortunate, if there's a chance to acquire a guy like Jason Robertson, you jump on that opportunity. So if he does become available and he's on the market and it's known that he's on the market, Kyle Dubas, if you're listening, you got to do what you can to try to land this guy because he's a guy that you can keep around for long term. If he signs an 7 to 8 year deal, he's going to be 32, 33 when that expires. He's still going to be a good player. He's got size. He's got skill. He's got scoring ability. You know, this is the exact type of young player. This is the exact kind of player that Dubas should be looking to add to help bridge that window of contention. This is a situation where you go big in the trade market for a guy like that. So of the names out there on the trade market, he's really the only one that I think the Penguins should, you know, pursue pretty aggressively if he does become available. Free agents, Mitch Marner, no chance. A couple months ago, if you would have asked me the same question, it might have given me some pause, but you know, Marner is going to want to play for a contender, and the Penguins just clearly aren't ready for that this summer. So wouldn't expect anything like that, but Robertson is somebody they should go after if that opportunity arises. But lastly, I think the most interesting, perhaps the most interesting of all the trade talk is the report that the Penguins are allegedly looking to trade up in the draft. Yes. The NHL Scouting Combine was a couple weeks ago. It started on June 1st. And we heard about some of the conversations Dubas had with some of the prospects there. You know, you heard Roger McQueen's name thrown out there. Kayshawn Aitchison, Radim Murka. You know, he talked to Victor Eklund as well. And this is courtesy of Cam Robinson. I cannot talk today, guys. I am so sorry. Cam Robinson of Elite Prospects, and then Josh Yohe, Pittsburgh Penguins beat reporter for The Athletic. You know, they were there covering the event. And, I mean, that was pretty much across the board. They both said that those are the people they met with. Obviously, Murka, Aitchison are both defensemen. McQueen's a center. Eklund's a winger. But this trading up thing is a little bit interesting because another guy that Dubas spent a whole lot of time with, and he also got the opportunity to see at the IIHF World Championship this year, was Porter Martone. Porter Martone. If you don't know the name, you're going to know the name in a few years because, you know, while Matthew Schaefer, defenseman, is pretty much the consensus top pick at this point, there was a time when people were talking about Porter Martone potentially being in that conversation for first overall. And, you know, on most draft boards, Porter Martone is still going in the top 5. And a lot of them, he's top 4. You know, there's Higgins, there's Michael Misa, Schaefer, but then there's Martone. He's typically right there. It's either him or Frundell on most draft boards. So it's interesting that Dubas is really high on this guy. He spent a lot of time with him at the combine. Like I said, Team Canada's brass was impressed with him at Worlds this season too. And you gotta wonder, is this something that's worth it for the Penguins to do? I wrote a piece on this earlier in the week where I was kind of talking about, like, hey, I'm not sure this is the draft to do that. Do you really want to give up assets for this year's draft when maybe you could save some of that for next year's draft and trade up, because by most accounts, the 2026 NHL draft is deeper than this one. This one's more top heavy, but I guess the more I thought about it, and I mean, I have seen Martone highlights, and I've followed him a little bit this past season, but he honestly wasn't really on my radar because, in my head, even before the Penguins were bumped down to 11th overall after the draft lottery, it never crossed my mind that Porter Martone would be a possibility for the Penguins, because they were 9th overall before that. But now with this news that they might be interested in trading up, I dug a little deeper, and I gotta tell you, I kind of feel like I changed my mind this past week. This is a guy who, if the Penguins feel like they can put together a realistic trade package to trade up in the draft to maybe 4th overall where the Utah Hockey Club sits, I think they should do it. And it might heavily depend on what happens with that Rangers pick. We'll know by Wednesday this week because they have to know 48 hours prior to the draft, which starts next Friday, or 2 Fridays from now. I'm sorry. My whole timeline is messed up. We'll know 2 Wednesdays from now, not this week, whether or not that's going to be this year's or next year's. So, we'll see what happens, but Martone is going to be a force in this league, I think. And, he's been compared to guys like the Kachucks. Some have compared him to Mikko Rantanen. There's been comparisons to Corey Perry, Andrei Svechnikov. You can list the comparisons for Martone. You kind of, when you start to dig into that, you see that this guy's valuable. I mean, his hockey IQ, his hockey sense is off the charts. I'd argue that he's the most skilled player in this draft, maybe perhaps even more so than Misa. He's got size. He stands at 6'3", 208 pounds. So there's even more to add there in terms of weight. He throws around the body. He's not afraid to get physical. He's good at the net front. He's good at creating space for himself to make plays. He'd be really valuable on a power play. The list goes on and on. I mean, again, this is a top-heavy draft. There is a massive difference between the top 4 or 5 names in this draft and the rest of the field. This isn't a situation where, maybe in 2026, you're still getting a type of player like that at 9th or 11th overall. No. There are only a few players, projected in this draft to be NHL stars. Martone is one of them. So if the Penguins have an opportunity to move up in the draft a player like Martone and, get their hands on a talent like that, a surefire talent, they should probably do that. I mean, this is a guy who will be a cornerstone piece for them if they're able to draft him. He's a right winger. Obviously, you'd love to see them draft a center if they can avoid giving up that Rangers first round pick and still move up in the draft. it'd be ideal for the Penguins to get their hands on a center. There are going to be other centers in this draft. It seems like by most accounts that teams are going to be kind of gunning for centers in the top 10. So a center might not fall to that 11-12 spot. There's Jacob Bryan, Roger McQueen. I already mentioned McQueen, Brady Martin. The likelihood of any of those guys falling is probably pretty low. But if you still have the opportunity to draft Porter Martone, you draft Porter Martone. So we'll see what happens with the Rangers first round pick. And if the Penguins decide to try to move up in the draft, we might not know till draft day. And, there is a possibility too, a small possibility that Martone could fall a few spots because of this focus on centers. I didn't mention Frundell as a center when I was, listing him off, but he's a center too. There's a possibility that, Utah or somebody else elects to take him, before Martone. So depending on what happens, we might see this as a draft day trade. But I do think that if they're trying to move up, he's probably their guy. And if he is drafted earlier, maybe they still move up to draft a center. It won't cost as much, I don't think, at that point. So that's still something that's conceivable. But Dubas seems to be very enamored with Martone. So kind of curious to see what the Penguins decide to do there. If they can get that New York Rangers pick this season, draft Martone, and then still be able to draft somebody like Eklund or even Aitchison or Merca, I'd walk away pretty happy if I were Kyle Dubas and company and if I were a fan. That's all I'm saying. I think regardless of what happens, the Penguins are going to get a good player in this draft. If the focus is on center depth and if they don't trade up, if they don't go for Martone, I think there's a decent possibility that Eklund might fall to that 11th spot. Because I do think Merca is going to be drafted in the top 10. I mentioned McQueen, I mentioned O'Brien, I mentioned Martin, I mentioned Frundell. Well, guess what? That's pretty much everyone. So somebody's got to fall. Eklund might be that guy to fall if center depth really is the focus. So if they got Eklund and not Martone, you should walk away pretty happy too. If they get that Rangers pick and they're able to draft a defenseman as well, like Aitchison, you should be pretty happy about that. But Martone's a game changer. He really is. If they are able to do it, do it. But that'll be all, guys, today. Thanks for tuning in. And again, thank you for being patient. I know this has been a painstaking process for both ends here. But like I said, I should be getting some news within the next couple of days. We'll see. But hopefully we'll have a more permanent co-host coming up to help us out. So thanks for tuning in. Again, I'm Kelsey Sermetz of the Hockey News. You can read my stuff on the THN Penguins website. Again, if you have not already, please follow the THN Penguins website, bookmark it in your Google News tab, and join the Roundtable community so you can interact with us, post to the Roundtable community, post to the site. Thanks for tuning in. As always, have a great week. I will talk to you soon, and, stay out of trouble and that.